It was the kind of spring afternoon that people in small towns remember for decades, not because of what happened, but because of how ordinary it felt before everything went wrong. Frankfort, Kentucky, May 3rd, 1992. The kind of day that smelled like cut grass and honeysuckle. When kids rode tricycles on quiet streets and the sound of wind chimes floated across backyards. 3-year-old Angelica Lewis was sitting on the front porch of her family's small blue house on Riverview Lane, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. Her mother, Carol, was just inside, folding a basket of towels, still warm from the dryer. The screen door was open, and from the kitchen window, she could see Angelica's little legs swinging off the porch. Step pink sandals, white socks with ruffled lace. Carol checked on her daughter twice in 10 minutes. She remembered glancing up at the clock. 2:47 p.m. The third time she looked, Angelica wasn't there. At first, it didn't register. Carol called her name, thinking maybe she'd wandered into the yard chasing a butterfly or gone around the side of the house. But there was only silence. No laughter, no footsteps on the porch. The street was still. When the realization hit, Carol dropped the laundry, ran outside, and began shouting, "Angelica! Angie, where are you?" Her voice carried down the road, startling a neighbor who was watering her garden. Within minutes, half the block had joined the search, checking behind fences, under porches, inside garages. But the little girl with the pink sandals had vanished without a sound. By 3:30, the first police car arrived. Within an hour, the scene was chaos. Marked patrol cars, flashing lights, and officers walking shoulder to shoulder through backyards. Detectives cordoned off the area with yellow tape, while volunteers fanned out along the nearby woods. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers shouting commands as they moved through the thick brush behind the Lewis home, leading toward the treen that ran along the Kentucky River. At 6:10 p.m., a helicopter circled overhead, its spotlight sweeping across the darkening landscape. The river shimmered below, deceptively calm. Onlookers gathered behind barricades, whispering the same question. How does a child disappear in broad daylight? The search lasted through the night. Officers found no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no dropped toy, not even a broken twig to suggest where Angelica might have gone. Her bunny, the one she never let go of, was found hours later on the porch, sitting upright as if placed there carefully. Detective Paul Garner, one of the first responders, would later recall that detail as the most chilling. It wasn't tossed, it wasn't dropped. It was set down like someone didn't want her mum to know right away. The next morning, police expanded the search perimeter. Dozens of volunteers combed the fields and riverbanks, while divers swept the shallows near the old fishing pier. Nothing. By the third day, search teams had covered a 3-meter radius using infrared scanners, horseback units, and canine teams. Still, there was no trace of Angelica. Then came the first and only lead. An elderly neighbor, Mus Hennon, told officers she'd seen a white sedan parked at the end of the Lewis driveway around 2:40 p.m. She couldn't identify the maker or model, only that the driver was a man wearing a baseball cap and that the car was gone later. Police canvassed nearby counties for vehicles matching the description, pulling registration lists, interviewing owners, even setting up roadblocks along US Route 60. Dozens of tips poured in from locals claiming they'd seen similar cars, but every lead collapsed under scrutiny. By the end of the week, the case had already begun to take on that heavy, hopeless familiar to small-town tragedies. The neighborhood that once left doors unlocked now closed blinds and double-checked locks. Parents walked their kids to school. Reporters hovered near the Lewis property, waiting for any sign of progress. But there wasn't any. Detectives explored every possibility. Family abduction. No custody disputes. Random kidnapping. Unlikely. There were no witnesses beyond Mrs. Hennon. Stranger crime possible, but rare for the area. There was no ransom demand, no suspicious calls, no physical evidence linking anyone to the disappearance. It was as if Angelica had been lifted out of the world and erased. Carol and her husband David appeared on local television a week later, pleading for their daughter's return. Carol's voice trembled as she said, "Please, whoever has her, just bring her home. She's only 3. She's scared without her bunny." That clip would replay for years. Whenever Frankfurt residents talked about the case, her eyes red, her hands clasped tight, as if holding on to hope itself. For months, the investigation consumed the community. Flyers bearing Angelica's photo, a smiling toddler with light brown curls hung in grocery stores and gas stations. Detectives followed up on every possible sighting. A girl in Bowling Green, another in Cincinnati, one reported near a rest stop in Tennessee. Each time, it ended in disappointment. By autumn, the tone of the case shifted. The search base was shut down. Volunteers went back to work. Reporters moved on to other stories. The only people who didn't stop searching were the Lewis Wises and Detective Garner, who kept the case file open on his desk long after others closed it. The official report listed the disappearance as suspected abduction, active investigation. But behind closed doors, the task force knew what it meant. Without physical evidence or witnesses, the odds of finding Angelica alive were slipping away. The final search effort took place in November 1992, when divers once again swept a section of the river after a fisherman claimed he'd seen a small pink shoe caught on the reeds. It turned out to be trash, a faded doll shoe, sun-bleached and half-buried in silt. After that, silence. Christmas came and went that year without Angelica. Carol left the porch light on every night, saying it was so her daughter could find her way home. David stopped talking to reporters altogether. The small blue house on Riverview Lane became a symbol of heartbreak, the place where a little girl vanished in the middle of an ordinary day and was never seen again. By spring of 1993, the search had officially ended. The Lewis file joined dozens of other unsolved cases in a locked evidence room at the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. Angelica's name appeared once a year on local missing children bulletins, her photo updated through age progression software. The faces changed, the technology improved, but the outcome never did. And yet, even decades later, investigators would say the case still haunted them, because from the very beginning, something about it felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing just one piece. There was no scream, no struggle, no trace, just a porch, a stuffed bunny, and a mother who looked away for less than a minute. No one knew it then, but the mystery that began on that quiet street in 1992 would remain buried for more than 2 decades, until years later, a forgotten box and a single handwritten letter would finally reveal what really happened to little Angelica Lewis. In the months after Angelica disappeared, the Lewis home became quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The toys on the porch never moved again. The flower pots Carol had once tended to began to wilt one by one. The sound of laughter that had once filled the house was replaced by a silence that stretched across years. For a long time, Carol refused to believe her daughter was gone. She kept Angelica's room exactly as it had been. The same pastel walls, the same stuffed animals lined up on the windowsill. Every night she would open the door, sit at the edge of the bed, and whisper goodnight to a child who never answered. The neighbors said it was like the house had stopped aging, frozen in 1992. David Lewis, her husband, carried the grief differently. He was at work the day Angelica vanished, a mechanic at a local auto shop off Wilkinson Boulevard, and that detail would haunt him for decades. He told friends he should have been there, that maybe if he'd come home early or taken a different shift, things would have gone differently. Over time, guilt hollowed him out. He stopped talking about the case, stopped sitting beside Carol when she appeared on the evening news, and began spending long hours alone in the garage, fixing engines that didn't need fixing. In those early years, Frankfurt police worked tirelessly to find answers. There were phone lines dedicated solely to Angelica's case, and volunteers handed out missing posters as far away as Lexington. But as weeks turned into months, the case began to unravel into confusion and frustration. Every time detectives thought they had a lead, it collapsed into nothing. One tip came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a child matching Angelica's description at a rest stop outside Bowling Green. When officers followed up, the sighting turned out to be a local girl traveling with her aunt. Another tip came from a woman in Nashville who believed she'd seen Angelica in a park with a man who didn't look like her father. Surveillance footage showed nothing. Every lead seemed to dissolve as soon as it appeared. Then came the calls, dozens of them, from people who claimed to have information. Some were sincere, some were cruel, and a few were simply unexplainable. One caller told police he had taken Angelica, then laughed before hanging up. Another claimed she was being held in an abandoned farmhouse near Laurenburg. When officers got there, the property was empty except for raccoons and broken furniture. In desperation, Carol turned to anyone who would listen. She went on local talk shows, appeared on early internet forums dedicated to missing children, even consulted psychics who promised to feel Angelica's energy. Every time she walked away with more hope than answers. Detectives didn't discourage her. They knew that hope was sometimes the only thing families had left. But behind the scenes, investigators were running out of places to look. By 1997, 5 years after the disappearance, the original task force had been disbanded. The sheriff's department merged the case into a growing list of long-term missing persons files. It became a case number instead of a name, KY 921437, one of many. That same year, Carol began organizing yearly candlelight vigils on the anniversary of Angelica's disappearance. At first, dozens of people came. Friends, neighbors, church members, even strangers who'd followed the case in the news. But as time went on, the crowd grew smaller. By 2000, it was just Carol and 2 other families from nearby towns who had lost children of their own. The human toll was impossible to ignore. David moved into the guest room sometime around 1998. He told people he couldn't sleep near the window that faced the porch. The sight of the empty step where Angelica used to sit was too much. Their marriage became mechanical. Polite conversations about bills, short exchanges about dinner, but no laughter, no warmth. Friends noticed. Some said it was like living with 2 ghosts under the same roof. Detectives who revisited the case over the years tried to bring fresh eyes. They re-entered neighbors, rechecked the area where the white sedan had allegedly been seen, and even reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for insight. But nothing changed the central fact. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no confirmed sighting. The case was like smoke, visible in memory, impossible to hold. In 2001, a new lead briefly reignited hope. A woman in Ohio reported that a teenage girl had come into her store looking disoriented and barefoot, claiming she didn't know who she was. When shown a photo of Angelica, as she might look at 13, resemblance was uncanny. Detectives drove 6 hours to meet the girl, only to discover she was a runaway from Illinois. The hope that had flickered for a few days went out again just as quickly. Around that time, a detective named Harold Grant, a young officer newly assigned to the Cold Case Division, began cataloging older files. He remembered seeing the Lewis case in the archive room, stacked between other unsolved disappearances. He'd later admit that it stood out to him because of how thin the file was. There wasn't enough there, he said. It was like they were missing a piece that should have been obvious. But with no new evidence, his hands were tied. By 2002, 10 years had passed. The sheriff's office officially closed the Lewis case as inactive, meaning it could be reopened if new information surfaced, but otherwise it was shelved. Carol was informed in a brief letter, 1 paragraph, stating there were no further leads, and the department extended its condolences. She kept that letter folded inside a Bible on her nightstand, reading it whenever she needed to remind herself that Angelica was still somewhere in the world, even if no one knew where. That same year, a new missing children's campaign launched statewide. It featured age-progressed digital composites of children who had disappeared throughout the 1990s. Angelica's face appeared among them, a computer-generated rendering of what she might look like at 13. Longer hair, older eyes, but the same small smile. Carol said the picture didn't feel like her daughter. They made her older, she told a reporter, but I still see her as 3. That's how she'll always be. As the years stretched on, Angelica's name became a familiar line in small-town newspapers, a yearly reminder in the Missing Children of Kentucky section that ran every May. People who had once known the family moved away. The reporters who'd covered the case retired. Even the neighbor who'd claimed to see the white sedan passed away in 2005. Inside the Lewis home, time had stopped. Carol worked part-time at a diner on the edge of town, a job that kept her from thinking too long between shifts. David drifted further into silence. Their marriage eventually ended in an unspoken separation. He left one evening in 2007, leaving behind only a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I can't live in this house anymore." Carol never filed for divorce. She just stopped referring to herself as married. Detectives would occasionally recheck the case, but each review came back the same. No suspects, no physical evidence, no progress. It became one of those names mentioned at conferences as an example of how time can swallow even the most haunting mysteries. And yet, through all those silent years, the files stayed in the same drawer, marked by fading ink and rusted staples. Angelica's photograph, the one taken on her 3rd birthday, remained clipped to the front. The little girl with the bright smile and pink sandals, still waiting, in a way, for someone to find her. No one knew it then, but the next time that file would be opened more than 15 years later, It wouldn't be because of a new lead or witness. It would be because of a simple clerical task. An old detective sorting through forgotten boxes, and a single Polaroid photo that had gone unnoticed for decades. Something was about to resurface quietly, like a voice returning from the past. By 2017, the case of 3-year-old Angelica Lewis had faded into the quiet background of Cuckey's long list of unsolved disappearances. Her name lived mostly in old newspaper archives and cold case databases, just another statistic from another decade. Inside the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, her file sat buried among hundreds of others in a windowless evidence room where dust gathered on boxes that hadn't been touched in years. That summer, Harold Grant, a retired detective nearing 70, volunteered to help the department digitize its old evidence storage. He'd served over 30 years on the force, long enough to know that most cold cases ended in silence, not answers. Still, he believed in something that many younger detectives had forgotten sometimes. The smallest, most overlooked details held the truth. He worked methodically, labeling and scanning every file he opened. The boxes were old, some collapsing under their own weight. The handwriting on their labels had faded to pale pencil smudges. Johnson, B., 1985. Teller, J., 1979. Unidentified, Lake Cumberland, 1988. Then, near the bottom of a leaning stack, he spotted one that caught his eye. The tag read, Lewis, a 1992. He remembered the name immediately. The missing girl from Frankfurt, the one whose case had once made headlines across the state. He had never worked the investigation himself, but everyone in law enforcement back then knew the story. 3 years old, vanished from her porch. No trace ever found. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside were plastic evidence sleeves yellowed with age, brittle paper reports, and faded Polaroids. As he sorted through the contents, something slipped out from between 2 reports. A small photograph, warped and stained from time. It was a Polaroid, the kind you had to shake dry in the 90 seconds. It showed a little girl sitting on the edge of a dirt road beside a rural mailbox. The number painted on the side of the post read 417. The child's face was partly turned away, but she appeared to be about 3 or 4, her head slightly tilted as if distracted by something out of frame. On the back of the photo, written in shaky pen, were 4 words, still close to home. Harold sat back in his chair, studying it under the dim fluorescent light. The handwriting was odd, uneven, almost hurried, like someone trying not to be recognized. The note wasn't dated, but the film type suggested it was from the early 90 seconds. He checked the case file. There was no mention of this Polaroid anywhere. Curious, he flipped through the old evidence log sheets until he found an entry dated June 1994, 2 years after Angelica disappeared. It referenced an anonymous envelope received by the Sheriff's Department, addressed simply to Missing Persons Unit. The envelope had contained a Polaroid photo. No letter, no return address. A clerk had apparently forwarded it to the Records Division, where it was supposed to be logged and processed. But somewhere in the chain of custody, it had been misplaced. The record showed no follow-up, no analysis, no indication that any detective had ever seen it. A clerical oversight. One small, forgotten detail buried under decades of paperwork. Harold studied the image again. The landscape behind the child was unmistakably rural. Kentucky. Rolling hills, low brush, a wooden fence stretching into the distance. He noticed something else. The mailbox wasn't attached to a house. It stood alone on a dirt pull-off with no structure visible nearby. He zoomed in on the scanned version, looking for any identifying features. A tree line, a power pole, anything that might help locate it. He opened the original property maps from the 1992 investigation. Back then, search teams had covered a 5-mile radius from the Lewis residence on Riverview Lane. But no property with the number 417 appeared anywhere in that range. It didn't make sense. The number clearly existed, but where? That phrase on the back, still close to home. It lingered in his mind long after he left the office that day. Most anonymous tips were vague or sensational, but this one felt different. It wasn't boasting. It wasn't mocking. It sounded like someone confessing or hinting, but with restraint. The next morning, Harold pulled the full Lewis case file from the archive and brought it to his desk. It was heavier than he expected. Nearly 400 pages of reports, transcripts, and witness statements. The early entries detailed the search efforts, the white sedan sighting, the interviews with neighbors. Later pages grew sparse, just annual updates, each stamped No new leads. He read through it for hours. The deeper he went, the more it felt like reading a story that had stopped mid-sentence. He found the old property search maps again, and this time, he noticed something others might have missed. There was a Route 417 listed in the area, a county access road that had been renamed in the early 2000s after flood damage destroyed several homes along the river. It wasn't a house number at all. It was a route marker, still close to home. The words clicked in his mind. What if the photo wasn't pointing to a property, but to a location? What if the sender was trying to tell investigators that Angelica was still nearby, close to the river, close to where she'd vanished? He began pulling old topographical maps, overlaying them with the original search grid. The Lewis residence sat just over a mile from the Kentucky River, near an area locals used to call Willow Bend. Route 417, before the renaming, had run parallel to the waterline before looping toward a dead-end field. It had been abandoned for decades after a flood washed out part of the road. That name, Willow Bend, came up in the file too. It had been one of the first areas searched in 1992. Crews had spent 3 days there, but found nothing. After the initial sweep, it was ruled out and never revisited. Harold leaned back in his chair, uneasy. It was possible the photo had nothing to do with the case. Anonymous mail wasn't uncommon in missing child investigations. People sent fake photos, false tips, even cruel pranks. But this image had sat unnoticed in an evidence box for over 20 years. No one had analyzed it. No one had cross-checked it. And it had appeared 2 years after the disappearance, when media coverage had already faded. Whoever sent it didn't do it for attention. That evening, Harold stayed late in the office, scanning the Polaroid into the digital system and attaching it to the case file. He wrote a short note to the department's cold case supervisor, recommending the image for review. But as he prepared to close the file, he hesitated. Something in his gut told him this was important. He looked again at the child in the photograph. The posture, the size, the hair, everything was consistent with a girl around 3 or 4 years old. He couldn't say for certain it was Angelica, but something about it, some small resemblance in the eyes or tilt of the head, was haunting. Before leaving, he slipped a copy of the image into his notebook. On the back, he wrote the same words that had been scrawled there decades earlier, still close to home. That night, as rain began to fall over Frankfurt, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just opened a door no one had dared touch in decades. He didn't know it yet, but that small, faded photograph, the one everyone had overlooked, was about to change everything, because buried within that message, hidden in plain sight for 23 years, was the first real clue to what had happened to Angelica Lewis. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and long nights uncovering the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep bringing these real mysteries to light, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you hardest. For more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description. Now, let's get back to the case. In January of 2018, a plain white envelope arrived at the Frankfurt Police Department. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. No stamps beyond the standard issue, no return address, and only 5 typed words scrolled across the front in uneven handwriting, to the mother of Angelica Lewis. The mail clerk assumed it was another old tip from a member of the public and placed it in the bin with routine correspondence. It might have stayed there for days, maybe even weeks, if a young officer hadn't recognized the name and brought it directly to Detective Harold Grant. Grant had spent the last several months quietly reviewing the Lewis case. Unable to shake the image of that faded Polaroid, he was convinced the clue had meant something, even if no one else believed him. The letter's arrival felt like a spark in a long, cold room. When he tore open the envelope, a single folded sheet of lined paper fell out. It wasn't typed or printed, just handwritten in a rushed, uneven script. It read, "I watched her grow up, though she never knew me. She was loved. I couldn't let her go that night. She was supposed to be safe. I can't carry it anymore. Look near the river where the willows bend." There was no signature, no date, no explanation. Grant read it twice before he said a word. The tone was strange, neither threatening nor gloating. It felt personal, remorseful, almost pleading. Whoever wrote it wasn't boasting about a crime. They were confessing to something that had been eating away at them for years. He immediately checked the postmark. It had been mailed from Nashville, Tennessee, less than 2 weeks earlier. He sent the envelope to the state forensic lab for analysis. The results came back within days. The paper and ink were modern, manufactured no earlier than 2015. That meant the writer wasn't someone recounting an old rumor or hoax. They were alive and had written it recently. Grant's mind turned to the line that stood out most. Look near the river where the willows bend. It wasn't just poetic phrasing, it was geography. The phrase mirrored something in the old case files, something from the early search maps. In 1992, part of the investigation had focused near a riverside area locals called Willow Bend. A curving stretch of land along the Kentucky River, research teams had combed through heavy brush and shallow water in the days after Angelica's disappearance. Nothing had been found back then, and after flood damage years later, the area had become overgrown and virtually inaccessible. Now, more than 2 decades later, someone was pointing police right back to it. The department held a meeting the following morning. Grant laid the letter on the table under a clear evidence sleeve and explained his findings. Some officers were skeptical, calling it another hoax or an attention grab, but Grant pushed back. The Polaroid from 1994 and the letter from 2018, both anonymous, both referencing being close to home, both hinting at the river, felt too connected to dismiss. Permission was granted for a limited search. Grant assembled a small team of officers, a forensic analyst, and 2 cadaver dog handlers. On a cold morning in late January, they drove out toward the river's edge where the old Willow Bend Trail used to be. What had once been a public path was now swallowed by nature. Trees had collapsed into the dirt, vines hung thick like ropes, and the air smelled faintly of stagnant water and silt. The team parked near the remnants of an old wooden fence, then followed the faint outline of what used to be the trail. The river was swollen from winter rain, its edges soft and muddy. The sound of the dog's paws pressing into the earth was the only noise besides the rustle of wind through the brush. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The handlers marked off small sectors, scanning the ground for changes in soil texture or depressions that could suggest a burial site. Then, around midday, one of the dogs suddenly stopped. Its nose lowered toward a shallow embankment, where the land sloped down toward the water. Seconds later, it barked sharply once, then again. The second dog followed, circling the same spot. Grant's heart began to race. The handlers gave the signal, possible hit. The team marked the area and began carefully clearing away the overgrowth. Beneath the first layer of leaves and roots, they uncovered a section of disturbed soil that didn't match the surrounding terrain. The dirt was compacted and darker, like it had been sealed off from the air for years. They radioed for forensic support. Within the hour, crime scene technicians arrived with excavation tools and a portable canopy. The dig began slowly, every inch photographed and logged. By evening, the spade of a technician struck something that wasn't soil. The sound was soft but distinct, a dull tap against plastic. They uncovered a large sheet of thick plastic, the kind used for construction or insulation, wrapped tightly and buried several feet deep. When they peeled back the top layer, the unmistakable shape of a human form appeared beneath. The scene went silent. The remains were fragile but remarkably preserved. The river mud, thick with silt and low in oxygen, had sealed the ground like a natural tomb. Forensic technicians worked late into the night, collecting samples and photographing every angle before carefully transferring the remains into evidence containers. When the results came back days later, the confirmation hit like a wave across the department. The DNA was a match. Angelica Lewis, the little girl who had vanished from her front porch in 1992, had been found 26 years later, less than 2 miles from her home. Grant sat in his car outside the apartment that night, staring at the photo clip to the file, Angelica's smiling face frozen at 3 years old. He'd spent months chasing a 30-year-old ghost, and now he was looking at her case not as a mystery anymore, but as a crime scene. Someone had taken her life, wrapped her in plastic, and buried her within walking distance of the place she'd disappeared from. The news broke quietly at first. Just a short article in the Frankfurt Daily Journal announcing the discovery of remains believed to be connected to a decades-old missing child case. But word spread fast. Reporters called non-stop. For the Lewis family, what had once been a lifetime of uncertainty turned into something darker. Confirmation. Carol Lewis, now in her late 50s, was notified in person. The officers who visited her home said she didn't cry at first. She just sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly before she whispered, "I always told myself she was close. But the letter still hung over everything. Who had sent it, and why now? Grant sent it for advanced handwriting analysis and forensic tracing, but whoever had written it knew what they were doing. No identifiable prints, no trace DNA. The postmark led only to a public mailbox in Nashville. Whoever sent it didn't want to be found, but they wanted the body to be. That paradox haunted Grant. He believed the writer wasn't trying to evade justice entirely. They wanted closure. They wanted someone to find what they couldn't keep hiding. In the days after the recovery, investigators began combing through the old case files again, comparing names, alibis, and connections. The original list of persons of interest was short: neighbors, family friends, distant relatives. One name in particular kept appearing: David Lewis, Angelica's father. His timeline from that day in 1992 had always been airtight. He was at work, verified by time cards and co-workers. Still, there were inconsistencies no one had fully examined back then. He had been the one to dig trenches behind their property for a garden the summer before Angelica vanished. He had owned a roll of industrial plastic sheeting that was never recovered. And now, 26 years later, a body had been found wrapped in the same material in an area he once used to fish and camp. Grant didn't say anything aloud at first, but the thought kept circling in his mind. The letter, the guilt in its tone, the reference to not being able to carry it anymore, didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded like someone close, someone who had watched the damage unfold year after year. The discovery had answered one question, but opened several more. The little girl was found, but the truth about what happened that night was still buried, just in a different way. And when investigators finally connected the evidence, when they discovered who had written that letter, the story of Angelica Lewis would take one final, devastating turn. The DNA results came back on a cold February morning, 2018. Detectives gathered around the small conference table in the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, their expressions unreadable as the forensics report was placed in front of them. The analysis was conclusive. The remains found at Willow Bend after 26 long years belonged to Angelica Lewis. For a moment, no one spoke. The name that had hung like a ghost in the department for decades was suddenly real again, written in black and white. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a crime. But the shock didn't stop there. Among the evidence collected from the site was a partial fingerprint lifted from the layer of plastic that had been wrapped around the small body. The print was faint, almost lost to time, but the forensic team recovered enough of it to run through the system. Hours later, the match came back. The fingerprint didn't belong to a stranger or an old suspect or a long-forgotten drifter. It belonged to David Lewis, Angelica's father. Detective Harold Grant stared at the results for a long time, replaying the facts in his head. David had been one of the first people interviewed in 1992. He'd been at work the day his daughter disappeared. His alibi had checked out. He'd helped organize search parties, appeared on television beside his wife, pleading for the safe return of their child. In the eyes of everyone who knew him, he was a father destroyed by tragedy. Now, suddenly, the evidence said something else entirely. Grant reopened the file that afternoon, spreading every old photograph, transcript, and map across the table. He started from the beginning: Angelica's disappearance, the timeline of that day, the neighbors' statements. Nothing about the case had ever added up cleanly. The lack of physical evidence, the neatly staged scene, even the stuffed bunny left upright on the porch. All of it had felt just a little too deliberate. If David Lewis had been responsible, it meant everything about the original investigation had been built on a lie. Detectives began quietly retracing his life. They spoke to former co-workers from the auto shop, now older and retired, and the picture they painted was far different from the devoted family man everyone had seen on camera. Back in 1991, a year before Angelica vanished, David had been drowning in gambling debt, frequenting underground poker games, borrowing money from people who didn't forgive easily. There had been rumors of threats, late-night phone calls, and tension at home. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments between David and Carol in the weeks before the disappearance. One remembered him yelling about starting over. Another said he'd talked about moving somewhere new and leaving the mess behind. But no one thought much of it then. Families argued. People said things they didn't mean. When the old financial records were subpoenaed, the debt became undeniable. David had taken out multiple payday loans in 1991, each one larger than the last. By early 1992, his accounts were nearly empty. and he was behind on mortgage payments. He told friends he was trying to figure things out. Investigators began building a timeline of that spring. On the day Angelica disappeared, David had clocked in at work at 7:58 a.m. and clocked out just before 3 p.m. A schedule that left a small window of unaccounted time between leaving work and arriving home. The drive between the auto shop and the Lewis residence was only 15 minutes. In the original investigation, that gap hadn't seemed important. Now, it was everything. Detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, David denied everything. He looked older now, gray hair, deep lines on his face, a man worn down by years of silence. He listened as they read the forensic report aloud. The words, "fingerprint match, confirmed." His hands trembled slightly on the table, but he kept his voice steady, insisting there never had to be a mistake. But when confronted with the photograph of the plastic sheeting, the compositional match to the material once used in his old workshop, and the fingerprint that placed him at the burial site, something inside him began to fracture. He put his head in his hands, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he told them what really happened. It had been an argument, something small, something he couldn't even remember how it started. Carol had left for the store, and Angelica had spilled something. A cup of paint water from the porch steps. He'd been under pressure, angry, exhausted from the debt, the fear of losing everything. He said he'd snapped. The next part came out in broken fragments. Shouting, the sound of her crying, a push, and then silence. He claimed it was an accident, that he panicked, that he didn't mean for it to happen. But what he described next wasn't the act of a man in shock. It was the methodical decision of someone covering up the truth. He wrapped Angelica's body in plastic from his garage, placed her in his truck, and drove toward the river. He'd known the area since childhood, had fished there dozens of times. The place he chose to bury her beneath the willows wasn't random. It was a secluded spot only locals knew, and the ground near the riverbank was soft, easy to dig. Afterward, he returned home, placed her stuffed bunny neatly on the porch, and called 911 to report his daughter missing. He confessed that in the days that followed, while police searched the woods and helicopters circled overhead, he joined the volunteers and cried on camera because he thought that's what a grieving father was supposed to do. When asked about the letter that arrived in 2018, David shook his head and said it wasn't him. That letter, as it turned out, had been written by his sister, Mary Ann Lewis, a woman who distanced herself from the family decades earlier. Detectives tracked her down in Tennessee. She was 62, living quietly outside Nashville, and when shown the photograph of the Polaroid, she broke down almost immediately. She told investigators that David had come to her in 1993, a year after the disappearance, during what she called a breakdown. He had confessed everything to her in tears, begging her not to tell anyone. She'd kept his secret all those years, believing the truth would destroy what was left of their family. But as she got older, the guilt became unbearable. When she saw news about the county's cold case digitization program in 2017, she realized the case might be looked at again, and she decided to send the letter. She wrote it anonymously, never expecting anyone to find the body. She just wanted to give Carol closure before she died. When detectives confronted David with his sister's statement, he didn't argue. He just nodded, quietly, crying into his hands. He signed a written confession that night. For Carol Lewis, the truth shattered what little peace she'd built over the years. The man she'd defended for decades, the man she'd mourned with, had been the one responsible all along. When asked later how she processed it, she said, "I always thought I'd been living with grief. I didn't realize it was betrayal." The confession closed one of Frankfurt's oldest cold cases, but the aftermath left deep scars. David Lewis was arrested and charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. In his statement to the court, he called it a mistake I've been paying for every day since it happened. The truth, however, was much heavier than that, because the story of Angelica's disappearance had never been about a stranger or a monster lurking in the dark. It had been about something far more ordinary and far more devastating. A moment of anger, a secret buried by guilt, and a family torn apart by the weight of both. But even after the confession, one mystery still lingered. The haunting words written on that old Polaroid, still close to home. The message had been literal, yes, but it was also something more. A reminder that sometimes the truth isn't hidden in the shadows at all. It's right there, buried quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the Lewis case, it felt like the end of an era for the small town of Frankfurt. For 26 years, people had whispered about what might have happened to the little girl with the pink sandals, the one who disappeared from her front porch in broad daylight. The discovery of Angelica's remains and her father's confession had finally brought the truth to light. But for the people who had lived through it, especially for Carol Lewis, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like loss all over again. David Lewis was sentenced to 35 years in prison for manslaughter and evidence tampering. In the courtroom, he didn't look defiant or angry. He looked empty. When the judge read the verdict, he stared straight ahead, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly, as though holding on to something only he could see. Carol sat behind him, not in the family section, but in the back row, away from the cameras. Reporters described her as composed, but those who saw her up close said she looked like someone who'd already cried every tear she had. In her first and only interview after the trial, Carol's voice trembled when she said, "I kept every birthday card, every missing poster, every anniversary notice. I just never expected the truth to come from a letter." She held the piece of paper as she spoke, the same handwritten note that had arrived in the mail that January, the one that had finally led to the discovery of her daughter's remains. She said she didn't hate the person who wrote it. "Whoever sent that letter did what I prayed for. They gave my daughter a voice again." The letter had come from Mary Ann Lewis, David's estranged sister. She hadn't set foot in Kentucky for nearly 2 decades. When investigators contacted her in Tennessee, she admitted she'd written it after years of carrying her brother's secret. She said she didn't do it out of anger, but out of guilt, because she couldn't stand knowing that a child's grave was still hidden while people prayed for answers. "I thought it might destroy what was left of the family," she told police. "But then I realized there wasn't really a family left to destroy." In the weeks after the confession, Carol's home became a museum of memory. The walls were lined with fading photos and newspaper clippings, the air thick with the scent of old paper and flowers. On the table by the window sat a box she had kept sealed for years. Inside were Angelica's favorite things: her bunny, a pair of tiny sandals, and the missing posters that had once been stapled to telephone poles all over town. She opened that box for the first time in decades the night before David's sentencing. She said it wasn't anger that made her do it. It was finality. Reporters who revisited the story in 2019 called it one of the most haunting cold case resolutions in Kentucky's history. It wasn't just because of how it ended, but because of how ordinary it began. There were no strangers lurking in the shadows, no mysterious kidnappers, just a father who made an irreversible mistake, and a family that carried the weight of that silence for nearly 3 decades. Detective Harold Grant, who had uncovered the Polaroid that reignited the case, later said that what struck him most wasn't the violence of the act, but the quiet of the years that followed. Everyone kept living around a secret, he said. The mother, the sister, even the community. Everyone was moving forward, but the truth was sitting there, buried near a riverbank the whole time. For him, the moment that stayed burned in his mind wasn't the discovery of the body or the confession. It was the detail that tied it all together. The number painted on the mailbox in the Polaroid, 417. For months, no one could figure out what it meant. But during the final stages of the investigation, county records revealed that before the flood of 1998, an old mile marker, 417, had stood less than 50 feet from the exact spot where Angelica was buried. The number hadn't been a house. It hadn't been random. It was a map. A message pointing quite literally to where she had been, close to home. That realization haunted Grant. It meant that whoever took that Polaroid, most likely David himself, had memorialized the place where he left his daughter, marking it with the same cold precision as a gravestone. It also meant that Mary Ann, when she found the photo years later among her brother's belongings, had probably known exactly what it meant and chose to send it back to the one place where it might finally matter. After the sentencing, Grant visited the river one last time. He said he wanted to understand what kind of man could come to a place like that and bury his own child. The air was still that day, the willows bending low over the water just like in the letter. "Standing there," he said, You could almost imagine hearing the echoes of search teams from decades before, calling Angelica's name into the trees. Carol never went back to Willow Bend. She said it wasn't where her daughter was anymore. Instead, she had a memorial stone placed in the small cemetery near her church, engraved with Angelica's full name and the dates that bookended a life far too short. Beneath the inscription were 4 words of her own choosing, still close to home. That spring, she invited the few remaining friends who had stood by her through the years to a quiet service. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a handful of people and a mother who had waited half a lifetime to say goodbye. She placed flowers at the base of the memorial, and then unfolded a small frame she had brought with her. Inside was the letter, the one that had started everything, the one that ended it. "To," she set it beside the stone, her hands trembling slightly as she whispered, "Now I know." The story of Angelica Lewis faded from the headlines after that, but in Frankfurt, it never really left. People still point to the old river road, the one that used to lead down to Willow Bend, and talk about how long the truth can stay buried before it finally finds its way back. Detective Grant retired later that year. The last case file he closed before leaving the department was Angelica's. He wrote just 3 words in the final summary line: recovered, confirmed, remembered. In the end, the mystery of the letter, the Polaroid, and the number 417 all led back to the same truth that sometimes justice doesn't arrive through evidence or luck, but through guilt, through the conscience of someone who can no longer live with silence. For 26 years, the Lewis family had lived in the shadow of a lie. And it wasn't a stranger's letter that finally set them free. It was the weight of truth carried across decades until someone found the courage to speak it aloud. And on that quiet afternoon at the cemetery, with sunlight filtering through the trees and the wind moving softly through the grass, it felt as though Angelica's story had finally found its ending. Not a perfect one, not a peaceful one, but a true